So we'll go ahead and get started. So we are in Micah chapter 5. I know we didn't meet last week, so it's been a couple weeks. So just to kind of recap what he's talking about at the end of chapter 4, he's basically, at the end of chapter 4, he kind of comments about how God, even though God is using Assyria to punish his people, he will in turn eventually turn around and punish Assyria for what they have done as well. So the idea is that the guilty will not get off, that they will be punished too. And so if you kind of keep that in the back of your mind and then move into chapter 5 and 6, then it'll kind of make a little bit more sense. So the idea is, even though he's using Assyria to punish Judah, he will eventually turn around and punish Assyria for the crimes that they commit. Yeah. Is the mic on? He says it's on. Can you guys hear me or not hear me? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Most people are saying it's good, Randy. I don't know. So we covered chapter 1 or verse 1 of chapter 5. So we're going to start in verse 2. Verse 2, you'll notice it's a fairly famous passage. It's quoted in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6. This is where he starts to offer some hope for the future, but it's hope for a remnant. It's not a hope for the entire nation. Okay. So in verse 2, he says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah," and he distinguishes the Ephrathah part is there are two different Bethlehems in Israel. So he's distinguishing which of the two he's talking about. So there is a Bethlehem in Zebulun, which is in the north, which would have been in Israel. It's a really tiny town. The one he's talking about is the one outside of Jerusalem, a couple miles outside of Jerusalem, which is the one we're familiar with. And so that's the one he's talking about. And so that Bethlehem is in Judah. And he says, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, and what he's talking about is that this Bethlehem is a very small town. There's actually several instances where the different cities of Judah are listed. So like when they go in to take the territories, there's a big long list of cities in Judah that they will conquer, and they'll take these cities. Then there's the list at the beginning of the book of Micah, where Micah talks about different cities that are going to be in trouble when Assyria comes in, and these cities are going to be knocked off. And then when you go to Nehemiah, Nehemiah talks about a bunch of cities that they're going to that will be involved when the people return that are in Judah. Bethlehem is never mentioned in any of these three lists, okay? And why is that? It's because Bethlehem's a tiny little town. It is not a significant city in terms of size within the tribe of Judah. So he's saying you're very small in terms of your size. It says, "Yet out of you shall come forth to me." In other words, someone or something is going to come out of Bethlehem that's going to represent God, okay? So this individual is going to represent God to the people. Then it says, "the one to be a ruler in Israel." And so he uses the word for ruler and not king here, but the idea is similar. He says, "whose goings forth are from of old," meaning he's been in existence before he comes in to play in terms of arriving in Bethlehem. He existed before that. And then the New King James says from everlasting. The ESV says from ancient times. What that actually may be an allusion to is meaning from an ancient family. In other words, he's going to be a descendant of David. Okay, so it's from an old family that everybody is aware of. Okay, so what you have here is a prophecy of this person that's going to come in the future. They will come out of Bethlehem, and they will be a ruler for the people, okay? I think we're all probably cluing in on who this might be at this point. But anyway, if you haven't picked up on it, this is a messianic prophecy about Jesus. So he's trying to give some hope for the remnant. Okay, so this chapter and the next chapter has a lot to do with the remnant people of God, and he's trying to give some hope to these people. So he's saying that there's going to be a ruler that's going to come forth, represent God to the people. Verse 3, it says, therefore he shall give them, verse 3, let me just look at something real quick. Verse 3, he's going to stop for a second. Okay, so verse 2 is about this future ruler, in other words, about Jesus that's going to come. But verse 3, he stops, and it's God talking about himself again. Okay, so in verse 3, he's not talking about Jesus, he's talking about God. So it says, therefore he, meaning God, shall give them up, meaning he will give up his people, the people of Judah he will give up. It says, until the time that she who is in labor has given birth, then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel. So what is he saying? He's saying that for a period of time, God is going to let his people be punished. In other words, they're going to go into captivity. But after this period of captivity, which he equates to the time of labor during childbirth, so after a period of suffering, those people in captivity will be reunited with the ones who did not go into captivity. Okay, so there will be a period of time where there's struggle and suffering, but at the end of that, the two groups, the one that went into captivity and the ones that didn't, will be reunited back in the land. Okay, so you have a picture of hope here. You have a picture of a coming ruler, a Messiah in the form of Jesus, and you have a hope of the country being reunited after these events happen. Okay. So now verse 4, he's going to go back to talking about the coming ruler, in other words, Jesus. Okay. So he says in verse 4, he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. So in other words, he's going to have a group of followers that are going to follow him. He's going to represent God. He's going to function in the strength of God. Then it says, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. In other words, he's going to represent God. He will be majestic like God. And it says, and they shall abide, meaning the people shall abide in him. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. So when it says, for now he shall be great, he doesn't mean when he's saying this, that's not the now he's talking about. He's talking about the now and the future when Jesus comes. So when Jesus comes in the future, at that time, Jesus will be great, and everybody, a knowledge of him will go out to the nations. Okay, so everybody will become aware of him and know that he came into existence on this earth. Okay, so verse 5. And this one shall be peace. Okay, so he will bring peace to the people. Now, that kind of pauses now on that part about the messianic prophecy part. Okay, so you had a messianic prophecy, then you had a little pause where you talk about the people going into captivity and coming back. Then you circled back around to more prophecies about the Messiah. And then that's going to stop, and the rest of the chapter is going to go back to the idea at the end of chapter 4, which is the guilty are going to get punished, okay? So at the end of chapter 4, he was talking about how Assyria, even though God uses Assyria as a tool, Assyria will be punished eventually for their actions. The rest of chapter 5, he is going to now talk about how Assyria will be punished, but he's also going to talk about how God is going to separate out from his own people a remnant which will survive and the guilty within his own people that will be punished, okay? So it's talking about separating out the righteous from the unrighteous. That's what the rest of the chapter is going to be about. And I'm going to kind of go through some of this kind of quickly because, for one, some of it I'm not entirely sure exactly what he means, and some of it's just kind of self-explanatory. Okay, so verse 5, the second line of verse 5. It says, when the Assyrian comes into our land, and when he treads in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. All that means is when Assyria comes, there will be leaders that will rise up to try to stand against them. Verse 6, it says, they shall waste with the sword the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. Nimrod, that's a reference back to Genesis chapter 10. Nimrod is the father of all of these cities that then eventually make up Babylon and Assyria. So he's using the name Nimrod to stand for Assyria. You can go back and read about Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10. Okay, so it says, thus he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads within our borders. Okay, so all that really is saying is that there's going to be hope for the future, that God will basically deliver them from the Assyrians. But in terms of a specific event where this actually happens in the way he says it's happening here, nobody really knows what it means, okay? So not a specific event in history where you can say, oh, that's what he's talking about. So I'm not sure what he means by it other than just to say that God is in control and God will eventually free his people from the Assyrian control. Okay, so as you move into verse 7, now he's going to talk about his own people and how he's going to separate out the righteous from the unrighteous, basically, within Judah. So verse 7, it says, then the remnant of Jacob, and Jacob here is standing for Judah, so you could just say the remnant of Judah, shall be in the midst of many peoples. So in other words, they're going to be spread out amongst many peoples. And he's going to use 3 figures of speech here. So verse 7 is a figure, verse 8 is a figure, and verse 9 is a figure. But they all mean the same thing, basically. Okay, so in verse 7 he says, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, that tarry for no man, nor wait for the sons of men. So what he's getting at is God is in control. Man doesn't have control over dew or the rain, okay? God is the one who controls that. And so just like God has control over those things, God has control over who he punishes and who he doesn't punish, okay? Verse 8, and the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, who if he passes through both treads down and tears in pieces, and none can deliver. So in other words, God will be in the midst of his people like a lion. The guilty will be destroyed by the lion. The innocent will not. This is kind of the idea that he's getting at. And then verse 9, your hand shall be lifted against your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. And it shall be in that day, says the Lord, that I will cut off your horses from your midst and destroy your chariots. And so what he's going to say here in these last 6 verses, and 10 through 15, is basically God's going to eliminate all the stuff that they're used to that distracts them from worshiping him. Okay, so all these things they depend on, or all these things that pull them away from God, for the remnant, God will remove these things so that they can worship him properly, whereas all the guilty will be punished. So he's going to laundry list a bunch of things that he's going to get rid of that they were involved in that they should never have been involved in. So verse 10, it says, I will cut off your horses from your midst and destroy your chariots. The idea there is Judah had built up a military where they had horses and chariots that God told them in Deuteronomy they should never do. They weren't supposed to do this. And so he's saying, I'm going to take away your trust in your military power. Okay, you don't need to have that. So he's going to take it away. Verse 11, I will cut off the cities of your land and throw down all your strongholds. So in other words, all these cities that you might remember from the introduction to this book, Judah had built up a bunch of cities that were basically defense-type cities that were outside of Israel. A bunch of these cities in a row that they kind of built for defensive mechanisms. And he's saying, I'm going to eliminate all these cities, which Assyria did. Assyria came in and basically destroyed most, if not all of them. And so he's saying, I'm going to take away your trust in these things that you don't need. Verse 12, I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no soothsayers. So were there people dabbling in mystical stuff in Judah? Yeah, there were. And so he's saying, I'm going to eliminate all that from your land too. Verse 13, your carved images I will also cut off, and your sacred pillars from your midst. You shall have no more worship the work of your hands. So he's saying, I'm going to get rid of all of your idol worship that you're doing. Verse 14, I will pluck your wooden images from your midst, thus I will destroy your cities. New King James doesn't specifically mention something here. Yeah, so in the ESV actually says, and I will root out your Asherah images, whereas the New King James just says, I will pluck your wooden images from your midst. If you have a footnote, your footnote for the New King James will probably say the Asherim instead of wooden images. Asherah is she's basically the consort of Baal. Okay, so if you think about Baal worship that you hear a lot about in the Bible, Asherah is the female counterpart to Baal. She is say it politely, she's sort of a sexual goddess. She's very similar to Artemis and Diana that you see in the New Testament, okay, that you see at the Ephesians. She kind of plays a similar role in the Canaanite, ancient Near Eastern mythology. And so were there Asherah poles in Judah at this time? And the answer is yes. So some of the people were into that. So he's saying, I'm going to get rid of that. And then he says, verse 15, and I will execute vengeance in anger and fury on the nations that have not heard. And so he just sort of ends it with if you want to call it a threat or a reality, that he is going to execute justice. So in other words, at some point, God will hold the guilty accountable, okay? And so for Judah, that time is coming. Now, did all these things take place? And the answer is yes. So the different things he mentions that he's going to take away from Judah, did all these things get taken away? And the answer is yes. So when they came back from captivity, did they ever have a lot of war horses and chariots again? No. Did they ever rebuild all these stronghold cities to protect them? No, not really. Did they ever really dabble in sorcery again? Not really. Did they ever have an idol problem again in the sense of having physical carved idols? And the answer is no. Okay, so God did eliminate all this stuff from them. Now, they developed new problems over time, like humans always do, but they didn't have these problems again. And so God did get rid of these issues for them. And so what is happening by them going into captivity, what they would view it as punishment, which it was, but you could also say it was a means of cleaning house, getting rid of the garbage, and getting rid of the people in the country that weren't going to follow him, and developing a remnant, cultivating a remnant that would actually be serious about worshiping God. And to some extent, that is what happened, okay? So that ends chapter 5. I know we went through chapter 5 kind of quick, but does anybody have any questions on chapter 5? Okay, chapter 6, I just want to get through about verse 8 tonight, so I'm not going to go super fast through some of this part. Okay, so chapter 6 starts off with, hear now what the Lord says. So in chapter 6, what you're going to start off with is a courtroom scene, okay? And so God is going to issue an indictment against his people, okay? So you're going to have three characters in this scene. You're going to have God, you're going to have the people, and then you're going to have witnesses, okay? And this is very common for ancient Near Eastern covenants or contracts, okay? So when you read an ancient Near Eastern contract or covenant, one of the things in the covenant is they will always mention witnesses to the covenant, okay? So in other words, once a covenant is signed or whatever, it'll list witnesses and say these are the witnesses. Therefore, if the covenant is ever broken, you can call forth the witnesses to say, yes, this party is guilty or that party is guilty, okay? So you're going to have some witnesses here in this as well that God's going to call forth to basically say who's guilty here, God or the people, all right? Now, the witnesses are not your usual witnesses. The witnesses are the mountains and the hills, all right? And we'll talk in a minute about why he chose those. All right, so if you kind of keep the three players in straight, it'll make a little bit more sense. All right. So chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice." So who's talking here? So this is God. God is in the courtroom, and he's talking to his people, and he's telling them, arise and plead your case. But before who? He's saying plead it before the witnesses. So the witnesses to the covenant that they signed, all right? When did they sign this covenant? Back in Deuteronomy, all right? Or Exodus and Deuteronomy. So they signed it, their ancestors signed the contract, all right? And so he's calling forth the witnesses from back when they made the contract or the covenant. And so the witnesses are the mountains, and then the next line says the hills, okay? So he's telling the people, you need to come forth, I'm accusing you, so you need to stand up and make your case before the people that watched you sign the contract, okay? And prove to them that you're innocent or guilty. All right, so verse 2, it says, "Hear, O you mountains, the Lord's complaint." So this is God still talking. So God turns to the witness and says, this is my complaint. Listen to what I'm saying. And also he says, "And you strong foundations of the earth." So God turns to the witnesses and says, okay, I'm about to tell you what my indictment or issue with my people is. It says, "For you have a complaint against his people." For the Lord has a complaint against his people, and he will contend with Israel. Okay, so God is calling them to court because they have broke the covenant. All right. Okay, so verse 3, it says, God is now going to open kind of his opening arguments in court, if you will. And he says, "O my people, what have I done to you? And how have I wearied you?" Okay, so why is he saying that? Well, he's saying that because they've broken the covenant. So he's asking a rhetorical question. He's basically saying to them, did I make the covenant too hard? Have I not been kind to you? Have I not somehow been faithful to my side of the covenant? Okay, and so he's basically making a rhetorical question. Obviously, the answer to the question is no. God has not wearied them, nor has God done anything wrong, nor has God broken the covenant. But he's asking them to testify to the witnesses how God has violated the covenant. He's basically saying, make your case. Okay, when did I go wrong with this? When did I violate it? And so he ends it with, in verse 3, it says, "Testify against me." Okay, now would you ever like to stand before God and make your plea against him about what he's done wrong to you? Okay, good luck with that, by the way. So verse 4, it says, now God's going to go on and kind of make his case where he's going to basically say, I did not violate the contract or the covenant. You are the guilty party, not me. So verse 4, it says, for I brought you up from the land of Egypt. Remember, that's when the contract, they didn't sign it at that point, but that's kind of when the ball got rolling. So he says, I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And so what he's saying is, I freed you from slavery, okay? I removed you from the situation. I gave you freedom from your slavery. But what have they done instead? They've made a mockery of the freedom God gave them, and they put themselves back into slavery. And you might say, well, how? Because they're not in slavery. They're in slavery to sin, okay? And that's what Romans is a lot about. The book of Romans is about being a slave to sin. And so they have chosen slavery over being God's servant, okay? But they don't see it or they don't recognize it. So they are deep in sin, and they are a slave of sin, and they are not a child of God in the way God wants them to be, okay? So he's starting back at the beginning when he says, I redeemed you, or I saved you out of this situation. All right, so verse 5, it says, O my people, remember now what Balak king of Moab counseled, and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him. So he's going back to a specific situation where God saved them from their own stupidity, okay, or tried to. So this is before they entered the promised land, if you remember the story. Balak, who is the king of Moab, if you remember, Moab is one of their distant relatives that they usually fight with. They don't usually get along. Moab is in modern-day Jordan. And what happened was the king of Moab hired a prophet named Balaam to go curse God's people. And the way they thought back then is once a curse is issued, you can't reverse it. They also thought once a blessing is issued, you can't reverse that either, okay? And so Balaam goes to issue the curse, but God intervenes and ends up with Balaam blessing God's people instead of cursing them, okay? Now Balak finds out about this, and he gets frustrated because the people were blessed instead of cursed. So what does he do? Well, he basically sends Moabite women into God's people, and they tempt them sexually to get involved in Baal worship. Okay, so the king of Moab takes it upon himself to destroy God's people when the prophet wouldn't do it for him. So he basically sabotages them by getting them to fall into the trap of Baal worship by having sex with his people, okay? And they fall for it because we're humans and we do stupid stuff. So God's reminding them of this situation, how he got them out of the initial problem, which was the issue with Balaam. He solved that situation for them, but they still did the wrong anyway, okay? And so that's what the next part is about. It says, from Acacia Grove to Gilgal. If you read another translation, it'll give you the name of the city. And if you have a footnote, it probably has the name of the city in the footnote. The reason the New King James says Acacia Grove instead of the name of the city is because if you don't know how to pronounce Hebrew, you will say a word that sounds like a curse word when you pronounce the name of the city, okay? It's spelled S-H-I-T-T-I-M, and you can see how that might go wrong when you say it, okay? but it's pronounced Shittim, okay, not the way we would say it. So that's why the New King James goes with Acacia Grove, because you don't want to get up here and read before the sermon and start saying stuff that the little kids think is vulgar. So that's why the New King James does that. All right, so, but the word Shittim does mean acacia trees, okay, so that's why it went with that approach. But why is he talking about acacia trees? He's going back to the situation where he's basically recalling what were all the events that happened between the time when you were in Shittim and when you were in Gilgal, okay? So the events that occurred between the time of Shittim and Gilgal, that is when the king of Moab got the people to sin. That's also when the spies went in to check out the land. And Gilgal is when they finally crossed the river into the promised land. So he's basically saying, remember all the events that happened between when you were in this city and this city, okay? And a lot of bad stuff happened when they disobeyed God, and a lot of good stuff happened when they did obey God, okay? So he's just reminding them of what all happened at that time. Okay, so verse 6 and 7 is now the people responding to God, okay? So God tells them, okay, you have to present your case before the witnesses. So now in 6 and 7, they're going to present their case. But their case is faulty logic, all right? And it's a bunch of rhetorical questions. All right, so verse 6, it says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? So it's asking basically, what can I as a human do to please God, okay? And then he's going to ask several things, like would this please God, would that please God, and so forth. So it says, shall I come before him with burnt offerings? Okay, now if you remember from all the prophets we've looked at so far, were the people supposed to offer burnt offerings? Yes. Did God only care about the burnt offerings? No. Were the burnt offerings of any value whatsoever without a proper heart and attitude about it? No. Okay. So he is not discounting offering sacrifices, nor would the New Testament discount proper worship. But neither of them are of any value whatsoever if you don't have a right relationship with God and your heart is not properly attuned to the situation, okay? So he says, shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? That's one of the preferred offerings they were supposed to give. Verse 7, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Now, God never asked of them to do thousands of rams or 10,000 rivers of oil. This is all overabundance, okay? So they're asking, if we gave you all this stuff, would that make you happy? And then they go on and they say, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? In other words, are we supposed to offer our children to you? Would that make you happy? Okay? And the answer is no. One, God never asked them to offer their children. In fact, he told them not to. Okay, so that's not even realistic. But the problem is, all the people around them did this. Okay, so the Canaanites did it before they got there. The Canaanites did it after they got there. The countries around them were still doing it at this time. And even some of Judah's kings did it, which one of the kings, while Micah is prophesying, is Ahaz, and Ahaz offered his son, okay? So even though God never asked it, this stuff is happening both in Israel and outside of Israel. And so the people are asking, if we did all this stuff for you, would this make you happy, okay? And so verse 8 is the most famous verse from the whole book, and that's where we'll stop tonight. So this is now the response to the verses 6 and 7. Okay, so basically the idea is, what do you want from us? Okay, we gave you all this stuff. Apparently you're not happy with this. What is it that you want? Okay, and so God's going to respond with, this is what I want, okay? So he says, he has shown you, O man, what is good. So that's Micah speaking. And Micah says, you're asking this question, what does God want? But God's told you over and over again what he wants. You're just not listening to him, okay? So God has told them through Moses and Aaron and Miriam, God told them through all the prophets that have come up to this point, including Micah himself, exactly what he wants of them. They should know what he wants of them, but apparently they don't. So he says, he has shown you, O man, what is good. So God wants from them what is good or what is right, okay? And it says, and what does the Lord require of you? So here's the answer to your question. What does God expect? Okay? To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Okay? So let's take them one at a time. He expects justice, all right? What did Micah accuse the people of doing earlier in the book? Injustice, okay? The wealthy people in the country are taking advantage of the poor people, okay? They are getting rich off of taking advantage of the poor. So God's own people are mistreating each other. So he's basically saying, what I expect from you is for you to treat other people the way you should treat them, all right? All people are God's creation. All people are made in the likeness of God. You are to treat everyone the way God would treat them, okay? You are supposed to be just with each person, okay? The next one, it says to love mercy, and that, it's not a bad translation, but it's a little, doesn't really convey the full thought. Okay, the word mercy here is the word I keep harping on over and over and over. It's the word hesed, okay? Hesed, best probably translated in English, means covenant loyalty, all right? So the first thing he says is you need to treat other people correctly. The second thing is you need to be loyal to the covenant, all right? Why are they in the courtroom in the first place? They broke the covenant, okay? So he's telling them you need to treat everybody fairly, but number two, you have to keep the contract. We had a contract. You signed the contract. You broke the contract. All right, so he's telling them you need to keep the contract. What are we supposed to do in the New Testament? We have a contract with God. He expects us to keep the contract, all right? The same rules apply now that they did then. The rules are different, but the concept is the same, all right? So he's saying you should love the covenant, all right? You should love it. You should keep it. You should obey it. And then finally, you should walk humbly with your God. And so what does he mean by humbly? Well, what is the opposite of practicing justice? It's oppression. So you oppress somebody, that's the opposite of justice. What is the opposite of loving the covenant? It's despising the covenant, breaking the covenant. What is the opposite of humility? It's pride. If you can't walk humbly with God, it's because you have a pride problem. And you will not allow your pride to let you walk humbly with God. The pride movement is actually aptly named, whether they realized it or not. The chief element of the pride movement is, I am going to do the opposite of what God tells me to do. And that is what's wrong with God's people here, okay? They act like they don't know what they're supposed to do. They know what they're supposed to do. They don't want to do it. That's the problem, okay? So is God asking for us to do anything extraordinary? The problem with human thinking is we often think God wants our most valuable thing, okay? So if you're a parent, what is your most valuable thing? Your child. What did he just say? I don't want you to sacrifice your child. That is not what I expect of you. What I expect of you is to treat other people fairly, keep our covenant that you signed a contract for and to walk humbly with me, okay? What does God want? He wants a relationship with us. He wants to be our Father. He wants to go on daily walks with us. And when you tell him, I think I'm too busy, I don't really want to walk with you. I don't want to walk with you. You have a pride problem, okay? And that's what's preventing you from having a relationship with God. And so that's why this is the most famous verse in the book, because it basically sums up what God actually expects. God does not expect heroics. God expects you to try each day to keep the contract, try each day to walk with him. None of us can walk and chew gum at the same time, and the older you get, the more you realize it. God doesn't expect us to keep the contract perfectly, but he expects us to keep trying every day and to keep walking with him every day. And if you do that, then you're in a right relationship with God. If you don't want to do that, then you have a pride problem, and that's what's preventing it from happening. We'll stop there because I know the second bell rings. Anybody have any questions? All right.